Abby Johnson brought an offering of chocolate tonight. And she is accepted by me, but she's not worshiping me either, so that's a good thing. Good to see you tonight. Started off to be a beautiful day, and then it turned out to be kind of a whatever's going on kind of day. I don't know what to think about the weather, but it's good that we're together tonight and we have this opportunity. 1 Samuel 8 is where we're going to be studying here in just a moment. I want to read something from the New Testament before we begin there. John chapter 19, verse 12. You don't have to turn there unless you choose to, but I just wanted to read this, kind of set the stage for our study tonight. From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." Pilate therefore heard that saying. He brought Jesus out, sat him down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priest answered, "We have no king but Caesar." 1 Samuel chapter 8. It came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now therefore, heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them, or forewarn them, and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them." So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king, and he said, "This will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots and to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands and captains over his 50s, will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage, and give it to his officers and servants. And he will take your male servants, your female servants, your finest young men, and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your sheep, and you will be his servants. And you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day." Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but we will have a king over us." that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he repeated them in the hearing of the Lord. So the Lord said to Samuel, heed their voice and make them a king. And Samuel said to the men of Israel, every man go to his city. I want you to try to think about, well, there's probably think about several things at the moment, but I want you to think about the crisis that has brought this meeting of the elders of Israel to Samuel's attention. You're getting old. Your sons are not like you. They're not good men. Now, what do we know about Eli, who had preceded Samuel? His sons were evil. They were vile. They were wicked men. Now, when you think about establishing a monarchy, a king, you think about a succession, do you not? You think, well, the king is going to have an heir, and he will take his place, and so on and so forth. You would think at this particular period of time that the elders of Israel would have certainly known about Eli and his corrupt sons. They now see Samuel as an old man, and his sons are corrupt. What makes them think that if they appoint a king, that somehow it will be different for them? I submit to you that their desire for and their receiving a king would eventually become the bane of their existence. It would be actually their undoing. It would be the ruination of the king, or the kingdom rather, of the nation of Israel. And yet they were determined to have it, and God allowed it. And there's a lot to be said about this. Burton Kaufman has, I think, in my opinion, a rather extreme view of this request. In Brother Burton Kaufman's view, Israel was totally in the wrong to ask for a king. That it was inherently sinful. There was nothing good or right about asking for a king. And so he takes the position that God granted them a king, but never intended for them to have a king. He even, of course, deals with what Moses had previously said in Deuteronomy chapter 17. He discussed that. Brother Burton Kaufman's take on that is that God anticipated this very meeting. God saw this happening, and so God was simply forewarning that when Israel asked for a king, like the other nations, then this is the kind of king you should have. And so Brother Kaufman takes the view that it was totally in error for Israel to have a king. I'm tempted to lean more in that direction than the other, only because the kings were all an abysmal failure. There wasn't any one of them that you could look to and say, he was great or he was grand. However, Jesus reigns on the throne of David. How could such a compliment be paid to someone if his reigning was so evil and so bad and so off base? Why would God liken his own son's reign over the house of Israel to that of David? Was David a good man? At times. At times he was a very wicked man. Committed adultery, was guilty of murder, was a man so full of blood and bloodshed that God would not even permit him to build a permanent structure, a house of worship. Instead reserved that for his son, who would reign in peace. But you might think of the kings of Judah and of Israel, and you would think David is at the top of the list. Later, you might think of Josiah. There were some others in that list that were good kings of Judah. But when we say good kings, we mean relatively speaking, they were good kings. The very first king, Saul, as we're about to learn, was an abysmal failure. Just simply rejected the word of the Lord and was rejected as a consequence by God. Solomon, the wisest, certainly, of all the kings, spread the seeds of folly and disunity, and eventually the nation would divide and split in two. And so, regardless of how you view the kings, it's hard to find anything really redeeming to say about them. So I'm tempted to lean kind of in Burton Kaufman's direction, although I think he takes, in my opinion, an extreme view on this point. You may have some insight you'd like to share with us. He does bring out some passages, for example, in the book of Hosea, and I'll just share those with you very quickly. You can reference them or you can look at them with me now if you'd like. But in Hosea chapter 8 and verse 4, let's see, the prophet here, speaking of the kings. They set up kings, but not by me. They made princes, but I did not acknowledge them. From their silver and gold they made idols for themselves, that they might be cut off. So the prophet here simply announces they set up kings, but not by me. Brother Kaufman says it wasn't God's will, wasn't God's intention, and this verse proves that. I don't think that's exactly what Hosea means. I think Hosea means what Samuel, or 1 Samuel chapter 8, is telling us. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But again, that was his view. Chapter 13 of Hosea, verse 10 and 11. God said, I will be your king. Where is any other, that he may save you in all your cities? And your judges to whom you said, give me a king and princes. And then he said, I gave you a king in my anger, and I took him away in my wrath. Probably a reference to Saul. But then again, it could be to the monarchy itself. The overall concept of having a king. And Brother Kaufman says, see here, Hosea is saying that God is acknowledging, I gave you a king, but I did it in my anger. And I took him away in my wrath. God wasn't pleased with this request at all, perhaps. And there may be some validity to that view. I'm not saying there is or there isn't. I'm just saying that's his view. I'm not sure that I'm willing to go that far. But it's worth thinking about. I believe that we need to qualify that view with what's being said here. When Samuel heard the request of the elders, what did he initially think? And that's evident from God's response to him. What did he think was happening? Rejecting him. We don't want you. And we certainly don't want your son to reign over us. So make us a king. And God clarified, did he not? They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. Now I want to digress for a moment. I have to digress. I think it's important that we digress sometimes. And I know you also say, well, here they go, get political again. I'm just making a point. When you go back to the 1700s, to the colonies that existed here in this now great country, and it is a great country. But when you go back to the 1700s, there are a lot of people here that did not want a king reigning over them, especially a king across the Atlantic Ocean, a king that they really didn't receive much benefit from. All they had to do was give him their taxes. It's kind of like the king that Samuel says you're going to get. And our forefathers said, we don't want that. We don't want taxation without. And so we're not going to pay these taxes anymore. We're not going to be loyal to the King of England anymore. You understand how that fared it out. And of course we had the war, and we were able, with God's help, providentially, to achieve independence from the King of England. Now, the first president of the United States stated, it is impossible to govern people without God and religion. Now, I want you to think about George Washington for a moment, what he was saying. He was encapsulating, I believe, the very sentiment and the driving force of those founding fathers, all of them. They were seeing the exact opposite of what the elders of Israel are here clamoring for. The elders of Israel want an earthly king to rule over them. And in saying that, in wanting that, they were also at the same time saying, we don't want God reigning over us. Notice what they said about the king. We want a king to fight our battles for us. Did they not know what God did when they came into the land of Canaan? How the walls of Jericho fell down and they went from city after city? Who was fighting their battles? We want a king to fight our battles. They were literally rejecting God and his reign, his protection. They wanted to replace God with someone else. The founders of this country said, we want to replace a worldly king a worldly monarch with God. We want God to reign over us. And you know, when you hear people talking about the unprecedented freedoms that we enjoy in this country, it's fascinating because we do enjoy great freedom. But how is this freedom possible? You go back to the founders, they were clear on this matter. The only way we can have that kind of freedom and sustain it is if people will govern themselves. Now, they didn't mean by that to live by your own standards, your own rules. They meant we will be a people of Christian values who read their Bibles, who have faith in God, and who will control themselves and their passions, and they won't have to have a strong, intrusive government to order their lives. They will do that for themselves with God reigning in their hearts. Now, I want you to think about that because today we are in the minority. And this nation today is going in exactly the opposite direction. And the further we get away from God and the further we get away from His Word, the more intrusive and powerful our government necessarily must become. If we can't control ourselves, someone had to control us. And that is an unfortunate reality. And I believe that's really a valuable lesson from 1 Samuel chapter 8 that's often missed. Tommy, you had a comment?
Yeah, when you take God out of school, what do you replace it with? Police officers, metal detectors?
Well, that's correct. Somebody's got to police these folks. And if we're not going to police ourselves, someone has to control us. And so we have to have a strong government. Give us a king to unite us. Shouldn't Israel have already been united under God? Indeed. Should they not be trusting in God? Absolutely. Who would raise up judges to deliver them? God, when they needed it. Who was fighting their battles? God. Well, we want a king. And God's telling them, you're going to get a king, but you're not going to be happy with him. And they weren't. They wouldn't be happy. Brian? Yeah.
Well, actually, even after that battle to gain their independence, there was a large number of people that actually wanted to make George Washington our king.
Yes.
Good thing there was enough people with enough wisdom then to recognize even what God warned Samuel of, that if that happened, it wouldn't end up the way we would want it to. So he was wise enough and I guess humble enough to deny and decline that position and insist that no, we have to develop another position of leadership rather than...
Well, he was a God-fearing man, and he wanted God to govern the affairs of this nation and not the government. It was God was their focus, not government. Thomas Jefferson loathed government, did not trust government. Thomas Jefferson was exactly right. We should not entrust government. We should trust God. God reigning over government. Now, I want you to think about a government that's dysfunctional. I'm not saying that we have one. I'm just saying, let's just pretend for a moment that our government was dysfunctional. Let's say, for example, that we elected a bunch of people to do a particular thing because they all ran saying, we're going to do this one thing. And they get in office and say, sorry, we can't do it. Okay, so just pretend for a minute we had a government that dysfunctional. Really? That's stupid enough. Say we did. Well, what's going to happen? There's going to be somebody that's going to step forward. What are they going to do? Well, I'll take executive pen and I'll start writing in laws. Well, where is that moving us? We say we didn't like it when that president did it. Well, now this president's doing it. I don't want any president to have that kind of power. Not in one branch. We have 3 branches of government for a reason. But when 2 of them are totally dysfunctional, then what's the other one to do? That's the scary thing. And the reason, my point is, and this is what Washington and others were saying, and this is true not only of government officials, but all of us. We have to be able to govern ourselves. And if we're just going to be corrupt judges, like Samuel's sons, that's not the answer. I mean, that itself should have told the elders of Israel, this is a losing proposition. You're wanting to establish a monarchy here. Okay, let's say you get a good guy to reign as your king. What's his son going to do? Is he going to follow in his steps? How can he be sure that it's going to maintain what good you think you're going to get from the first king you appoint? I mean, it just didn't make any sense. It's just not a model that's really worth pursuing, but they were stubborn and determined. Tommy?
Well, you know, that we're further on the tail of it, but he says you're gonna take your sons and your daughters. That's who's gonna fight the wars, it's gonna be your sons and your
Yeah.
daughters. You know, he's not gonna fight, he's gonna send your sons and daughters to fight.
Yeah.
And that's where you're gonna have heartache, because his judgment may not be a good judgment, send them in a battle and they just totally get annihilated.
You're entrusting your life, your livelihood, and your family in the hands of a man. How foolish is that when you could entrust all of that to God? Who has your interest at heart? Well, we know God does. Not so sure about my fellow man, but I know God does. So how foolish is this request on their part? Indeed, it was utter folly. Away with him. Crucify him. Give us instead a murderer. That's what Peter literally said that. You desired a murderer and killed the Prince of Life. Not just the Prince of Life. You killed God in human form. You killed the Son of God. And you chose a murderer instead. That's the folly. And the reason I mentioned John 19 to start with is because we're seeing the seeds of that madness right here in 1 Samuel chapter 8. We don't want God. Away with him. Give us a king like all the nations. So Samuel warned them, as you pointed out, Tom. He warned them. It's kind of like today. We have, well, I would say global warming crisis. We really don't have a global warming crisis. We have a global cooling crisis. Did y'all hear that in the news, by the way? All that's come out recently. You probably didn't hear that because you're probably hearing about Russian collusion. But actually, in the news, this is true. We know the polar ice caps are growing. We know, all this is well documented. So we're actually, the planet's actually cooling. We've been told all this time, we're going to blow the planet up by driving SUVs, blah, blah. And so now we're cooling. That's what it was when I was a kid. It's just kind of shifting again, where the pendulum going back and forth. We're burning up, we're going to freeze it. We're going to burn it up, we're going to freeze it. Like we have control over it, of course. And like this hasn't been going on since the dawn of time, or at least since the days of Noah. But nevertheless, that's what we're told. And so we have a global climate change now. We're just going to call it climate change because we can't keep up with whether it's going to freeze or burn up. So it's just climate change. Okay, so what do? Well, we give more power to the EPA. Aren't you glad we have an EPA director that wants to sue the EPA? That's interesting, isn't it? I think it's wonderful. That's providence right there. That's providence. But I'm just saying that's how we typically respond to things. We have this crisis. And so we're going to find a solution to this crisis that we've created in our own minds. Usually we just make it up. And the solution winds up being worse than the problem. It's kind of like, your knee hurts. And so you go to the doctor, and he says, you need to go see an orthopedic surgeon. And before you know it, your leg's amputated, and you're dying of some kind of terrible disease you got from the operating table. It'd be better just to have a hurt knee. Just don't go to the doctor because they're going to kill you. I'm sorry, but I've seen that happen all the time. You stump your toe or something, and before you know it, the doctor's giving you some kind of crazy medication. You're looping, you can't remember who you are anymore. Like, well, I just stumped my toe. But the cure is often worse than the disease. And that's what Israel is. They're complaining. They're saying, Samuel, you're getting old. Your sons are not walking in your ways. That's a legitimate observation to make. It's just that their reaction to it and their response to it was misguided. Rather than seeing this again, what do we learn in chapter 7? It was time for reformation. It was time for repentance. It was time to return to God. And they seemed to do that for a brief period of time until God delivered them from the oppression of the Philistines, at least for a period of time. But now that they're enjoying relative peace and freedom, let's go in a different direction. They quickly forget how God had thundered. What did that mean, by the way? Thundered on the Philistines. I don't know. Imagine Dragons has this song of thunder, or whatever that's supposed to mean. But I can imagine something like that's happening with these Philistines. And so here we go. Whatever that is, I don't know what kind of miracle it was, but God delivered Israel from the Philistines. They've already forgotten that. We want a king. And so we're looking for an answer, a solution. And the solution is generally more servitude. Saul would not obey God. David was an immoral man. Solomon would sow the seeds of discontent, and the monarchy just went downhill from there. Israel, the northern nation, eventually, as it would be formed, never had a good king. Not a single one. And Judah didn't have many. They had a few, but relatively speaking, they were better, we might say, than others. Samuel was disturbed with the complaint they brought to him. God said, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Any other thoughts from chapter 8? Chapter 9. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power, and he had a choice and handsome son whose name was Saul. There was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward he was taller than any of the people. Now the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. And Kish said to his son Saul, please take one of the servants with you and arise and go and look for the donkeys. So he passed through the mountains of Ephraim and through the land of Lisha, but they did not find them. Then they passed to the land of Shaalim, and they were not there. Then he passed to the land of the Benjamites, but they did not find them. And they come to the land of Zuph. Saul said to his servant who was with him, come, let us return, lest my father cease caring about the donkeys and become worried about us. And he said to him, look now, there is in this city a man of God, and he is an honorable man. All that he says surely come to pass, so let us go there. Perhaps he can show us the way that we should go. Saul said to his servant, but look, if we go, what shall we bring the man? For the bread in our vessels is all gone, and there is no present to bring to the man of God. What do we have? And the servant answered Saul again and said, look, I have here at hand 1/4 of a shekel of silver. I will give that to the man of God to tell us our way. Formerly in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, he spoke thus, come, let us go to the seer, for he who is now called a prophet was formerly called a seer. By the way, does anyone have an English Standard Version handy? Are you looking at an English Standard Version?
Sure.
Is verse 9 that I just read there? Formerly in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, he spoke thus, come, let us go to the seer, for he is now called a prophet, was formerly called a seer. It's in parentheses, okay. It's in parentheses in the New King James as well. You know why it's in parentheses?
Wasn't translated originally.
Wasn't part of the original text. It was basically a comment by one of the translators. It was inserted in King James translator picked it up, and it's still here, and we're still having to bat it around. It's true. I mean, the comment's true. Doesn't take anything away from the text, but you can see by these comments that it's probably it was a gloss, something that was added by the man who was textually translating. Anyway, Saul said to his servant, well said, come, let us go. So they went to the city where the man of God was. As they went up to the hill to the city, they met some young men, or rather women, going out to draw water, and said to them, is the seer here? And they answered to them and said, yes, there he is, just ahead of you. Hurry now, for today he came to the city, because there is a sacrifice of the people today on the high place. As soon as you come into the city, you will surely find him before he goes up to the high place to eat. For the people will not eat until they come, because he must bless the sacrifice. Afterward, those who are invited will eat. Now therefore go up, for about this time you will find him. So they went up to the city, and as they were coming into the city, there was Samuel coming out toward them on his way up to the high place. Now, the Lord had told Samuel in his ear the day before Saul came. That's interesting, isn't it? Tomorrow about this time I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him commander over my people Israel, that he may save my people from the hand of the Philistines, for I have looked upon my people, because their cry has come to me. So when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said to him, there he is, the man of whom I spoke to you. This one shall reign over my people. Then Saul drew near to Samuel in the gate and said, please tell me, where is the seer's house? Samuel answered Saul and said, I am the seer. Go up before me to the high place, for you shall eat with me today, and tomorrow I will let you go, and will tell you all that is in your heart. But as for your donkeys that were lost 3 days ago, do not be anxious about them, for they have been found, and on whom is all the desire of Israel? Is it not on you and on all your father's house? And Saul answered and said, Am I not a Benjamite, of the smallest of the tribes of Israel? And my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then do you speak like this to me? And Samuel took Saul and the servant and brought them into the hall and had them sit in place of honor among those who were invited. There were about 30 persons. And Samuel said to the cook, Bring the portion which I gave you, of which I said to you, set it apart. So the cook took up the thigh with its upper part and set it before Saul. And Samuel said, Here it is, what was kept back. It was kept apart for you. Eat, for until this time it had been kept for you, since I said I invited the people. So Saul ate with Samuel that day. This was Samuel's portion, by the way, just gave it Saul. When they come down from the high place into the city, Samuel spoke with Saul on the top of the house. They arose early, and it was about the dawning of the day that Samuel called to Saul on the top of the house, saying, Get up, that I may send you on your way. Saul arose, and both of them went outside, he and Samuel. As they were going down to the outskirts of the city, Samuel said to Saul, Tell the servant to go on ahead of us. And he went on, But you stand here a while, that I may announce to you the word of God. Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on his head and kissed him and said, Is it not because the Lord has anointed you commander over his inheritance? When you have departed from me today, you will find 2 men by Rachel's tomb in the territory of Benjamin at Zelzah, and they will say to you, The donkey which you went to look for have been found, and now your father has ceased caring about the donkeys and is worrying about you, saying, What shall I do about my son? Then you shall go on forward from there and come to the terebinth tree of Tabor. There 3 men going up to God at Bethel will meet you, one carrying 3 young goats, another carrying 3 loaves of bread, another carrying a skin of wine. And they will greet you and give you 2 loaves of bread, which you shall receive from their hands. After that you shall come to the hill of God, where the Philistine garrison is. It will happen when you have come there to the city that you will meet a group of prophets coming down from the high place with a stringed instrument, a tambourine, a flute, and a harp before them, and they will be prophesying. Then the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you, and you will prophesy with them, and be turned into another man. And let it be, when these signs come to you, that you do as the occasion demands, for God is with you. You shall go down before me to Gilgal, and surely I will come down to you to offer burnt offerings, make sacrifices of peace offerings. 7 days you shall wait till I come to you and show you what you should do. So it was, when he turned his back to go from Samuel, that God gave him another heart. And all those signs came to pass that day. When they came there to the hill, there was a group of prophets to meet him. The Spirit of God came upon him, and he prophesied among them. And it happened when all who knew him formerly saw that indeed he prophesied among the prophets, that the people said to one another, What is this that has come upon the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets? Then a man from there answered and said, But who is their father? Therefore it became a proverb, Is Saul also among the prophets? And when he had finished prophesying, he went to the high place. Then Saul's uncle said to him and his servant, Where did you go? He said, To look for the donkey. When we saw that they were nowhere to be found, we went to Samuel. And Saul's uncle said, Tell me, please, what Samuel said to you. So Saul said to his uncle, He told us plainly that the donkeys had been found, but about the matter of the kingdom, he did not tell him what Samuel had said. Samuel called the people. Let's just stop here. Let's go back and let's look at what's going on in chapter 9. If you're looking for a king, you probably have in mind some picture, some image of what that king's going to look like, what he's going to be like. Now, what description do we have of Saul, son of Kish? He's tall.
Tall and handsome.
Tall, handsome, good looking, and rich. Come from a wealthy family. It was a small family. It was a small tribe. The tribe of Benjamin had been almost completely, utterly decimated during the period of the Judges because they were very wicked, immoral people, and the other tribes ganged up on them and just about utterly annihilated them. In fact, they had to take intervention to salvage this small tribe and revitalize it. It's just now coming back to its own. Eventually, we become one of the more respected of the tribes. And so we see here that this is still a small tribe, still a small family. And Saul rightly asked, Who am I? Now, if God had chosen someone from the tribe of Ephraim, the tribe of Judah probably would have said something about it. Had he chosen someone from the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Ephraim probably would have said something about it. These are two large rival tribes that probably were kind of like Alabama and Georgia. I'm sorry, Georgia and Alabama. Got to get it right. You know, you got two rivalries going on here. And so God just chose this small, almost seemingly insignificant tribe and chose a man from that tribe. But of all these people in Israel, he was the best looking man. What would you expect from a king, right? Good looking, tall, handsome, come from a wealthy family. We're going to later learn he was also courageous. He had a lot of great qualities and the kind of things you might look for in a king. Why do you suppose God did this?
He's always the first of everything, the best of anything and everything. On him. Why would he give him the evil king to rock?
You're saying ugly's evil? Short's evil? Poor's evil? I mean, I'm just thinking, why would he choose somebody like, but I hear what you're saying now. Your point's well made. God's certainly choosing the best to present to Israel. That's true, but you want a king, and obviously God knew what they had in mind. So here he is. This is what you envisioned. Here he is. I found just the guy you're looking for. And so God puts him in charge. Now,
you thought that they would listen to a good-looking tall man instead of an ugly short man? No, I'm saying that's what he, I mean, that's,
you know what?
because that's the way people think.
I guess.
Wow.
I mean, Napoleon had he had a lot of things to compensate for, but he was a short guy. Anyway, something wrong with his hand. He stuck it in his shirt all the time. I'm not sure what that was about. I mean, there have been some short men, that were successful leaders, military leaders and such. But Madoff, by the way, Secretary of Defense, he's kind of a short guy, isn't he? But he's kind of a short guy. But he's a great leader. I'm just saying God's giving these people what they're looking for, what they've envisioned. Now, he's going to be replaced. God will replace him. And when God replaces him, something very significant happens in that replacement. Because when God goes to Jesse's house to look for a replacement, all the sons are brought out there, starting with the eldest. Not him. No, not him. No, not him. No, not him. No, not him. Well, I got a little boy. He's not really old enough to be considered. He's out here watching the sheep. Well, bring him here. That's him. And the reason God said, I've chosen him, is because God doesn't look on the outward appearance. God looks on the heart. God's looking at your character. He's not interested in all this stuff that we get so carried away with. God's looking at the man for who he is and for what he is. And so when God chooses a replacement, and I'm saying all this to make this point, God's standards are very different than ours. God's view of things is very different than our view of things. In fact, the prophet Isaiah said, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so what? God's ways and our ways. As my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. God doesn't think the way we think. He doesn't see things the way we do. The real trick for us is to learn, what does God think and how can I think like God? And that's what 1 Peter, by the way, or 2 Peter, rather, chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, I believe, is telling us to be partakers of the divine nature. The only way we can do that is to add to your virtue knowledge. I mean, we can't possibly be a partaker of the divine nature without knowing what that nature is, without knowing what his thoughts are, what his views are. And so it's really our duty and responsibility to know what is the mind of Christ, what is the way God sees things, what are his priorities. For example, when it comes to the church, God sees the church very differently than we do. When it comes to the home, God has a very different view than we do. When it comes to government, God has a very different view than we do. When it comes to our personal life and choices and priorities, God has a very different set of priorities than we do. It's up to us to figure out what are those priorities and adapt our lives accordingly. Yes, sir? You had a comment?
I want to deviate you from your chain of thought.
No.
But something I've always wondered about in this text. Moses had said, we'll get rid of those high places.
Yes.
And now here, God's people are worshiping in high places, seemingly with God's approval.
Samuel is.
Yeah, would you comment on that?
Well, we already read in 1 Samuel that the central place of worship that God had named has now been lost because of Israel's sin.
Right.
And so there is no longer a central focal point of worship that God had said. What is to be done if that's not in place? Not worship at all? Samuel is clearly going to a high place. And it is confusing because in the book of Samuel, we're going to continue reading, in the Kings and the Chronicles, the high place is almost always associated with idolatry. And I would submit to you, very likely, because when you go off to the quote-unquote high place, it's kind of like saying, I'm going to go off and do my own thing. Some churches, there's a fad that started back in the 80s, and very popular in the 90s, and probably still going on now, where churches would dismiss their evening service and would have house churches. And what was happening was, you take the church and subdivide it into groups, and be 4 or 5 families go to Steve's house, and 4 or 5 families go to the Wilson's house, and 4 or 5 families go to the Johnson's house, and so on and so forth. And you got a little group meeting in all these little houses. What's wrong with that? Well, I had a first cousin from a congregation in North Atlanta that was participating in that. It wasn't long until she was saying to her father, I know because I worked with him at West Georgia, she saw nothing wrong with instrumental music. This started when they started doing these house church arrangements. And I'm like, would that have happened had the elders hired a faithful, sound gospel preacher to preach and to teach and to maintain? Or if they're going to go off to the high place and do their own thing? I think probably the high places were associated with idolatry because, in fact, when God told Joshua and Moses, when you go into the land of Canaan, you're not to worship on these high places because every man is no longer going to do what's right in his own eyes, but you're going to worship in the place that I name. And so I think that's what wound up happening. They're going off to these high places to do what was right in their own eyes, which led to idolatry and all kinds of abuse. But it was not always that way. In the case of Samuel, clearly, he was a faithful priest, and he's serving the people that would worship with him in a proper way under these undesirable circumstances. It was the best they could do. But I'm saying that I think my father's right to bring this point up because it's confusing, because you say, if you're worshiping in a high place, it must have been a bad thing. Not always was it a bad thing. It's kind of like synagogue worship, and where did it come from, and how did it get started? Well, if Jerusalem is destroyed and there's no more temple, and you're in Babylon, what are you supposed to do? Something had to take its place. We've got to continue to read the law, continue to study, continue to worship. Providentially, isn't it interesting how the synagogue is almost completely modeled as the New Testament church is? I mean, almost verbatim, absent the Lord's Supper, but it's interesting how those are parallel. You had another comment?
You ever lived the story our mentor, Brother Rica Senior, used to tell some of the students he was teaching, wanted to be a little facetious, I suppose, and were kind of mocking him about something and called him a name, and he said, no, I'm not that boys. I'm Saul, the son of Kish, looking for my father's donkey.
I think I found them. Yeah, that was a nice way of insulting people, wasn't he? I remember one time I was in the break room eating a donut and drinking a cup of coffee, and Brother Rex Turner walked in and just stood at the table and looked at me and shook his head. Some men make their belly their God. I said, thank you, Brother Turner. I love you too. I didn't eat donuts in the break room anymore. Number 814 in your psalm books, please. Don't forget this weekend to fall back with your time. So it'll be dark sooner in the evening and light sooner in the morning. Don't forget the gospel meeting at Lithia Spring with Bobby Lydell goes through tomorrow evening. Services are at 7 o'clock. If you haven't had a chance to go this week, tomorrow night will be a good time to go hear Brother Lydell at Lithia Springs. Don't forget the youth devotional at the home of Doug and Paige Paris, November the 5th. Young people, bring chips, desserts, drinks, and the festivities start at 5 o'clock. Please remember Regina and Renee's stepfather. He is declining rapidly and is not doing well at all. And my mother-in-law is not handling it very well. And Renee is there with her now. Regina just got home late yesterday evening. And so it looks like we're going to have pretty much round-the-clock help for them. And so it's going to require a lot of travel on their part. Certainly it's a difficult time for the family. So please remember them in your prayers, and especially Brother Larry Bingham, very, very good man, and sorry that he's suffering as he is, and Gwen, of course, as well. Any other announcements? Anyone else on the sick list we need to announce tonight? Away with him, crucify him. That's what the Jewish leadership said of Jesus. They did not want Jesus reigning over them. Obviously, they were unaware of the true consequence of their rejection, the significance of their rejection. In rejecting Jesus, they were literally rejecting God. And when we reject Jesus ourselves, when we refuse to do as he says, to submit to his will, we are doing the same thing. We are rejecting God. We're going to sing the song of invitation. At the end of each service, we traditionally offer this period of time for those present who need to respond to heaven's invitation to do so at this time. It's a convenient time. We're here, we're assembled. This would be a great time for you to obey the gospel, to be added to the body of Christ, or if you need the prayers of the church to respond, to repent, and make things right, certainly make your repentance known and your confession made here before you leave tonight. And I assure you will be making the right choice. If we can assist you in any way, please make that need known while together we stand and as we sing.
Have you been to